Theater of the Middle Ages. So first let's talk about the major players of this era. Roswitha was a major player of this era. She wrote plays about laudable chastity and holy maidens and wanted to celebrate them. And they were performed at the court or at the monastery. She herself was a religious leader and a noblewoman. Some significant things that she contributed to theater were that she was the first known female playwright. She was the first known post-Roman playwright. So before historians weren't sure if they really had theater and playwrights during this era, but she was the first known one. And she showed proof that there was intellectual continuity from Rome to the Middle Ages. So there wasn't like a gap as far as theater or arts went. Our next major player is Bishop Ethelwood. He wrote down in his journal how to perform a specific Easter service, and because it was a performance and he wrote directions that kind of looked like staging and different things, they thought that he was quite like a playwright for that area. Our next section that we're going to talk about is the historical events of this time era. So to begin, Rome collapsed, and it left a devastation for the country with not a lot of trade, not a lot of anything really, and the arts and entertainments were just not heavily induced. And so for a while, historians didn't even think that theater and fine arts made it from Rome to the Middle Ages, but as Roswitha showed, it did. Our next major historical event during this era is that by 1200, population started to increase, and the towns grew, trade grew. Because of it, more arts were being partaked in, and so the theater began to arise again. However, there was beginning to be this separation of church from the everyday life. Martin Luther came onto the scene with his threat to the church, and that kind of was part of the separation of church and everyday life. So this next section I am calling advancements. However, we're going to talk about more of the evolution of the theater during this time period. So the first thing is simultaneous staging. So going back to Roswitha and Ethelwood's time when they were writing, they had simultaneous staging, which means that they had several locations on the stage all at once. So this picture is an example of that. You have the house where you can see several rooms. You have the living room in the front. You have what looks like a dining room, and then maybe like a study or something on the right. And so what this says is you can watch a scene of two people on the second floor as shown. There are two people there right now. They can have a scene where they're talking there, and then your next scene can be down in the front where the girl is sitting on the floor, and there's no set changes or anything. It's all on one stage at all times. Theater then was also emblematic, which meant that meanings were portrayed through symbols, costumes, and props and different things. So it wasn't easy to communicate what you were trying to do on stage to the people that were watching far away. So a lot of things were emblematic. They made giant gestures or whatnot. So this picture would be an example of that. Clearly it's not raining on stage, but to show you that it's raining, she has an umbrella in her hand. And then also her outfit and her suitcase kind of show you the time period that she's most likely in. And this would be an example of emblematic because the picture is symbolizing what is going on in the play. Then lastly, the theater then was environmental, and this doesn't mean that they went green or anything, but it does mean that they used whatever space was available to them. They didn't have specific theaters built for their plays. Like today we have the Broadway theaters that are built specifically for plays. Back then they didn't have that, so they just had their plays wherever they could make room for them. So this is kind of an example for that. It's been modified so they have seats, but essentially they took what was already there, a mountain, and they made their play arena out of that. But they'd also most likely use churches at this time or monasteries, stuff like that, places like that. After 1200 was when they split from the church, and so they started performing outside of the church, which changed a lot for them. This is an example of the theater arena performing outside of the church, very similar to the picture we saw on the last slide, where it's kind of like it's in a hillside, but you can see it's outside. The plays at this time were spoken. Most of the time when the plays were in the church, they were chanted or sung, but here instead, when they broke away from the church, they did a lot more spoken plays. Your average people were actors at this time, opposed to when they were in the church was most likely religious people, religious leaders, clergymen, bishops. But now that they were outside of the church, they had regular people being the actors, and they were male for the most part. The plays stayed religious after they moved out of the church, but they didn't stay scriptural, so they would be about the lives of Christ, or the life of Christ, or the lives of the saints or disciples. They'd have plays about miracles and different stuff like that. Sometimes they'd be allegories related to religion, but they weren't necessarily straight from scripture. So here we have a picture of some angels playing instruments. So it's religious but not scriptural. Okay, then they also had cycle and cosmic plays, which meant that their plays went over a period of days or weeks to be completed. So you go to the play and you watch part of it, and then the next day you come back and watch more of it and more, and then the next day more, and then so on and so forth until the play was finished. But you didn't just sit down and watch the whole play. Okay, so for our last section of advancements, because they were outside the church, instead of the church being in charge of constructing the plays, most of the times it was the guilds and the fraternities. However, it could have been other people as well, like political leaders or something. Although there's no text on exactly what kind of acting they did, it was most likely emblematic still because they had a lot. They didn't have a lot of the technology still. They had fixed staging, which means that they had a structure that was already there and people came to see the play at this fixed structure. So here's an example of that. So they have this structure made up and they're acting in the center of it, and then the people on the outside of the structure are coming in, they're watching the play. I actually thought this was an interesting picture just because the structure is so different. It's not necessarily like a theater, but it could be a theater as well. And then they had movable staging, which was where they came to the audience and in the streets and perform for them there. Here's a picture of that. And then the Masters of Secrets were the people that did the special effects. Flying, sharp doors, fires, stuff like that. And that's where they were so honored and regarded because it was kind of like they were magicians putting on the show. So that was pretty much it for the Theater of the Medieval Ages. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.